Snow fell in slow, endless veils. It was the kind of snow that muffled hoofbeats and swallowed the sound of your own breath, the kind that made the world feel like it was made of ash and silence. It was as if heaven itself had burned down and left nothing but pale dust to drift over the mountains. She sat slumped in the back of the wagon, a quilt too thin to stop the cold pulled tight around her shoulders. Her eyes were fixed on the distant, jagged line of the peaks. Behind her, she could still hear the voices from town, the familiar whispers that had decided her fate with a careless shrug. Her name was Alara, and she was 18 years old. But in that moment, she felt much younger, and the weight of what they'd done was heavier than any winter storm. The wagon stopped. Through the swirling snow, she saw it. A cabin, half buried in drifts, looking like a single dark tooth in a mouth of white. A stubborn thread of smoke wounded its way upward from the chimney, a lonely sign of life against a gray sky. The cabin door opened, and there he stood. He was a giant of a man, with shoulders like stacked timber and a beard flecked with frost. His eyes were as dark and unreadable as the mountains he called home. Two small children hovered at his sides, their faces half hidden in the shadows of the doorway, like nervous ghosts. The townsman who drove the wagon didn't wait around. He muttered something sharp about duty, about debts being paid, and then all but pushed her out into the snow. By the time Alara got to her feet, the wagon was already disappearing back into the storm. The man, Jonah McGraw, didn't move. He just stood there, vast and silent, watching her. The children, a boy of maybe 10 and a girl no older than 7, peeked out from behind his thick coat, their breath rising in faint clouds. For a long, terrible moment, nobody spoke. The snow filled the silence, thickening the air until Alara thought she might choke on it. Finally, he stepped aside. He didn't say a word, just left the door open. An invitation that felt more like a command. She crossed the threshold, and the warmth of the fire hit her like a physical blow, but it did little to soften the dread coiling in her stomach. The cabin was spare but solid, built from rough-hewn logs. It smelled of pine and smoke. Shelves were lined with jars of beans and cornmeal. Her eyes caught on a quilt folded neatly at the foot of a large bed, the stitching worn from another woman's hands. His late wife, she guessed, and quickly looked away, feeling like a trespasser. Jonah closed the door behind them. The sound shut out the storm, but it also felt like the locking of a cage. Alara stood in the middle of the room, trembling from a cold that had sunk deeper than her bones. The children retreated to the far side of the hearth, bending over a small wooden toy horse. They didn't look at her again. Jonah moved with slow deliberation, feeding logs to the fire until sparks leapt up the chimney. The flames threw his face into sharp relief, carving deep lines at the corners of his mouth. At last, without looking at her, he spoke. "There's stew on the stove." His voice was low and gravelly, as if it was seldom used. She nodded, unable to find her own voice, even though a sharp hunger was clawing at her insides. She didn't move toward the pot. She was afraid that even the scrape of a ladle would be an intrusion. Instead, she found a stool near the wall and pulled the threadbare quilt tighter around her shoulders. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the hiss of the fire and the faint whispers of the children. Every now and then, she caught the boy glancing at her, his brow furrowed in suspicion. He looked just like his father, a miniature storm cloud. The girl whispered to him, tugging at his sleeve, but his frown never eased. Alara closed her eyes, wishing she could just vanish. But vanishing was a luxury the town had already denied her. She was here now, given away like a parcel no one wanted. But what she didn't understand, what she couldn't possibly know, was that the town hadn't just been getting rid of a burden. They were getting rid of a witness. The first night was an eternity. Alara lay stiff and cold on a narrow cot in the corner, listening to the storm press against the walls. Sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept replaying the scene in town. the whispers of the women who turned their backs, the averted eyes of the men, the pitying shake of the preacher's head. She was given away because no one else would have her. The words echoed, cruel and sharp. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not break. Morning came, pale and brittle. Frost had painted the window panes in delicate, icy ferns. Alara rose before the others, a habit born from a life of not wanting to be in anyone's way. She quietly stirred the embers in the hearth, adding wood until a new flame caught. She found the water pail was half empty. After a moment's hesitation, she wrapped herself in a shawl and carried it outside. The cold stabbed at her lungs. The well was rimmed with ice, the rope stiff with frost. She drew water until her hands were raw and numb, her knuckles split and bleeding. When she returned, Jonah was awake. He was sitting at the table, watching her. He said nothing, but his gaze lingered a moment longer than it had before, and that was all. The days that followed were a blur, bound by snow and silence. Alara learned the rhythm of the cabin. She learned the way Jonah chopped wood in long, steady arcs that sent chips of pine flying. She learned the way the boy, Thomas, sharpened knives with a careful, almost obsessive pride. She learned the way the little girl, Mary Beth, hummed softly as she sewed clumsy stitches into scraps of cloth. Alara tried to find her own place in that rhythm. She mended torn hems. She swept the ash from the hearth. But Thomas met her every effort with narrowed eyes, his jaw set in a line of stubborn resentment. One evening, when she offered him a piece of fresh bread, he muttered, "We don't need you," and turned away. The words stung more than any winter wind. Still, small mercies crept in, like the first signs of a thaw. One afternoon, Mary Beth quietly placed a small, hand-carved doll in Alara's lap, then darted away with a shy smile. That night, Alara found a bundle of kindling neatly stacked by her bed. It had to be Jonah's doing, though he never said a word. These were the only exchanges that mattered. Quiet gestures. Silent acknowledgments that maybe she wasn't entirely invisible. She clung to them like a drowning woman clings to driftwood. But as the winter deepened, so did the danger. And it wasn't just coming from the mountains. The first real blizzard hit one evening with a vicious howl, rattling the shutters and driving snow into every tiny crack of the cabin. The whole world seemed to be shaking. Soon their supplies began to run thin. The last jar of beans was scraped empty by the flickering light of a single lantern. Jonah's face grew sterner, his silence heavier than the snow piling up outside. Thomas's resentment sharpened into something cruel. "If you hadn't come," he hissed one night when his father was outside, "there'd be more for us." Alara had no defense against his words. She just endured them. But later that night, when she saw the boy's coat was ripped at the sleeve, she mended it by candlelight, her stitches neat and even. He said nothing about it the next morning, but she saw a flicker of shame in his eyes before he turned away. The storm worsened. They were sealed inside, prisoners of the wind and snow. Their breath hung in clouds even beside the fire. Jonah worked without rest, fighting his way through the storm to chop wood, dragging it back half frozen, his beard crusted with ice. One evening, the fire was threatening to die completely. Jonah was exhausted, asleep in his chair. Alara knew what she had to do. She wrapped herself in furs and slipped out into the blizzard. The cold was a physical thing, clawing at her skin, stealing the air from her lungs. She fought her way to the woodpile, hauling armfuls of frozen branches back to the door, her body trembling with the effort. Just as she reached the threshold, her knees gave out. She collapsed, the world spinning into a vortex of white and black. Strong arms lifted her. She felt the radiating heat of Jonah's chest, his rough beard against her temple. He carried her across the room and laid her near the fire, piling heavy blankets over her. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he checked her raw, frozen fingers. And for the first time, she saw the mask of silence crack. His eyes were fierce, dark with an emotion she couldn't understand. It looked like anger, but it felt like fear. She wanted to ask him why he cared. Why he had lifted her so carefully when he had barely looked at her for weeks. But the words were frozen in her throat. Before she could find them, he had turned away, stoking the fire with an almost frantic energy. She lay there, the warmth slowly seeping back into her bones, listening to the storm rage outside. And for the first time, she felt a tiny tremor of belonging. In the flickering firelight, she could see the children watching her. Thomas, still guarded. Mary Beth, her eyes wide with something like hope. But Alara had a sudden chilling thought. The town had been so eager to send her away. They had called her a burden, a curse. But what if that was a lie? What if they hadn't sent her here to be cared for? What if they had sent her here to die? After the fire, the silence in the cabin changed. It was no longer the heavy, awkward silence of strangers. It was something else. A shared silence, forged in the heat and the fear. They had survived something together. The blackened skeleton of their home stood stark against the snow. They salvaged what they could from the ruins, their faces streaked with soot. Alara's body ached, her hands were a mess of blisters, but she didn't complain. She held Mary Beth close, rocking her gently, while Thomas hovered nearby, his earlier resentment gone, replaced by a quiet, guilty awe. Jonah worked, his movements methodical, rebuilding. But he watched Alara. When their eyes met, there was a new understanding in his gaze. He had seen her courage. Word of the fire, and of Alara's role in saving the children, reached the valley. But the story the town told was not one of heroism. It was a story of a curse. When Jonah and Alara went to town for supplies, the whispers were louder, sharper. Martha Pike, the preacher's wife, stood by the general store and raised her voice so all could hear. First his wife, now his home. What curse does that man carry, to bind himself to such ruin? The crowd tittered, eager for cruelty. Sheriff Amos Cutter just smirked, his hand resting on his gun. Alara lowered her gaze, shame burning her cheeks. But Jonah didn't move away from her. He stepped forward, his shadow falling over Martha Pike. His voice was deep and steady, though it shook with a fury he held tightly in check. You call her a curse? He held up Alara's hands, showing the raw, red burns to the crowd. My children are alive because of this woman. You will not speak her name again, unless it is with honor. The air went still. The town's cruel laughter died in their throats. Even the sheriff's smirk vanished. They left the town in a stunned silence. But as they walked away, Alara saw something that made her blood run cold. The sheriff wasn't looking at Jonah. He was looking at her. And in his eyes, she saw not just contempt, but a flicker of genuine fear. Why would the sheriff be afraid of her? That night, as she was sorting through the few things they had managed to save from the fire, she found it. Tucked inside an old book of her mother's, a book she hadn't opened in years, was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a letter. It was a deed. A deed to a small plot of land, right in the center of town. The very land where the new church was being built. And the deed was in her father's name. Her father had died years ago, in a mining accident the town had called a tragic misfortune. But now, Alara started to wonder. Her father had owned the most valuable piece of land in Reedridge, and after his accident, that land had somehow ended up in the hands of the church, with Sheriff Cutter and Preacher Pike overseeing the transaction. They hadn't sent her to Jonah's cabin to punish her. They had sent her there to bury a secret. They thought a winter in the mountains with a broken man would be the end of her. The fire was just a lucky accident that should have finished the job. But they had underestimated her, and they had no idea who they were dealing with in Jonah McGraw. Alara took the deed to Jonah. She watched his face as he read it, saw his eyes darken as he understood the implications. "My father," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't think his death was an accident." Jonah looked from the deed in his hand to the determined set of Ilara's jaw. He was a man who understood land, and he knew what a piece of property like that was worth. He also knew what men like Sheriff Cutter and Preacher Pike were capable of. He had thought he was taking in a burden, a payment for an old debt. He realized now that he had been given a weapon. "They're not just trying to get rid of you," he said, his voice a low growl. "They're trying to silence you. Permanently." The next morning, Jonah and Ilara rode down to the valley, but they didn't go into town. They went to the small, neglected cemetery at its edge. They found her father's grave, marked by a simple wooden cross. Jonah began to dig. An hour later, his shovel hit something that wasn't dirt. It was the rotted wood of a coffin, but inside, there was no body. There were only rocks. The town had buried an empty box. Whatever happened to her father, he wasn't here. His disappearance, the deed, the fire, it was all connected. And the entire town was in on the secret. They were standing in a field of lies, and the truth was buried somewhere far deeper than a grave. The empty grave confirmed their darkest suspicions. Ilara's father hadn't just died in an accident. He had been disappeared. The whole town was complicit, bound by a conspiracy of silence that stretched back years. "They have to pay," Ilara said, her voice a cold, hard whisper. "They will," Jonah promised. But he knew it wasn't that simple. Sheriff Cutter wasn't just a bully. He was the law. And he had the entire town in his pocket. They rode back to the burned-out shell of the cabin, the deed tucked safely inside Jonah's coat. As they sifted through the wreckage, looking for anything salvageable, Thomas found it. A small iron lockbox, warped by the heat but still intact. It was hidden under a loose floorboard in what used to be Jonah's bedroom. "It was my wife's," Jonah said, his voice rough. He had never spoken of her, not really. Now he pried open the lid with the tip of his knife. Inside, protected from the flames, was a leather-bound journal. Jonah's wife had been the town's schoolteacher before she died. She was smart, and she was observant. And she had been keeping a record. Her elegant handwriting filled the pages, detailing small, seemingly insignificant events. A late-night delivery to the back of the saloon. A secret meeting between the sheriff and a stranger from out of town. A sudden, unexplained increase in the church's building fund. She had been piecing together the same puzzle Ilara had just uncovered. And the last entry, dated the day before her hunting accident, was chilling. "Amos knows I've been watching," she wrote. "He warned me today. He said curiosity is a dangerous thing in a town with so much to hide. He mentioned the old Miller mine. I think whatever happened to Mr. Jensen, the answer is there." Mr. Jensen, Ilara's father. Jonah closed the journal, his face a mask of cold fury. His wife hadn't died in an accident. She had been murdered. Silenced, just like they had tried to silence Ilara. This wasn't just about justice for Ilara's father anymore. This was about vengeance. The Miller mine was a played-out silver claim, abandoned for 20 years, a gaping wound in the side of the mountain, about 5 miles from their ridge. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Jonah and Ilara made their way to the mine. Thomas, now a silent, determined shadow at his father's side, insisted on coming with them. The entrance was boarded up, but the wood was old and rotten. Jonah tore it away with his bare hands. Inside, the air was cold and stale, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something foul. They lit a lantern. The tunnel stretched into darkness. 50 feet in, they found what they were looking for. A skeleton, half buried in a shallow grave, the skull crushed by a heavy blow. And another. And another. There were at least 5 bodies. The missing men of Reedridge. The prospectors. The travelers, the ones who had asked too many questions. And at the bottom of the pile, a tarnished silver locket. Elara recognized it instantly. Her father had given it to her mother on their wedding day. The truth was more horrific than they could have imagined. For years, the leaders of the town had been robbing and murdering anyone who stood in the way of their greed. Her father's land was just the beginning. The Miller mine wasn't a grave, it was a treasure chest. His wife had stumbled upon their secret, and they had killed her for it. But as they stood in that tomb of secrets, they heard a noise from the mouth of the tunnel. The scrape of boots on rock. They were trapped. Sheriff Cutter stood silhouetted against the night sky, a shotgun in his hands. He wasn't alone. Preacher Pike was with him, along with 3 other men from the town council. "I knew you'd figure it out eventually," the sheriff said, his voice calm and cold. "Your wife was a clever woman, McGraw. Too clever for her own good. Just like this one." He gestured with the shotgun toward Elara. "We gave you a chance to disappear. We gave you a quiet life in the mountains, but you just couldn't leave well enough alone." "You murdered them," Jonah growled, stepping in front of Elara and Thomas. "You murdered my wife." "Business is a messy thing," the preacher said, his voice smooth as oil. "Sometimes sacrifices must be made for the good of the community." "You're not the community," Elara shot back, her voice ringing with a courage she didn't know she possessed. "You're a cancer that's been poisoning it from the inside." The sheriff laughed. "It doesn't matter what you call us. In a few minutes you'll be just another secret at the bottom of this mine." He raised the shotgun, but just as he was about to fire, a voice echoed from the rocks above them. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Sheriff." Everyone looked up. Standing on the ridge above the mine entrance, silhouetted against the stars, were 20 men. Ranchers, farmers. The forgotten men of the valley, the ones the town council had cheated and bullied for years. They held rifles in their hands, all of them aimed at the 5 men in the tunnel entrance. Thomas had done it. While Jonah and Elara were in the mine, he had slipped away, running the 5 miles back to their nearest neighbor, sounding the alarm. The sheriff and his men were caught. Trapped between the ghosts in the mine and the guns on the ridge. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, the sheriff made his choice. He spun around, grabbing Elara, holding her as a shield. But he had underestimated her. She drove her elbow hard into his ribs, and as he gasped in pain, she brought her heel down on his instep. He roared, his grip loosening for just a second. It was all she needed. She broke free, diving to the side as a volley of rifle fire erupted from the ridge. When the smoke cleared, the town's dark secret was finally over. The sun rose on a new reed ridge, a town cleansed by fire and truth. The federal marshals arrived a week later, guided by Jonah's neighbors. The journal, the deed, and the bodies in the mine were all the evidence they needed. Standing on the porch of their newly rebuilt cabin, watching Mary Beth and Thomas play in the yard, Jonah finally turned to Elara. He didn't have a ring. He didn't have pretty words. He just had a question. "Will you stay?" he asked, "and build this with me?" Elara looked at him, this giant of a man who had shielded her from the world. She looked at the children who had become her own. She looked at this home, born from the ashes of 2 broken lives. "Yes," she said, her voice full of a certainty she had never known. "Always." The West was still a wild, dangerous place. But Elara had learned that home wasn't a place you found. It was a place you built. And family wasn't just about blood. It was about the people who stood with you when the world tried to bury you. If you believe that even in the darkest of places, the truth will find a way to the light, do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you want more stories about the untamed heart of the frontier, make sure you're subscribed. You never know what secrets are waiting to be uncovered.